I appreciate so much that you laid a biblical and theological foundation for us for really the whole day, and reminded us of such important theological doctrines that God is the ultimate good and that the kingdom is here, but not yet fully. I think those are incredibly important for us as we unpack more about the healthcare system. And I was reminded, as you were speaking, Dr. Castillo, of Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament scholar's work on scarcity to abundance to neighborliness, and that if we fear scarcity or we fear not having health or that kind of good that might replace God, then we hoard. Right? We hoard the resources, the limited resources of the world, rather than being generous and hospitable and neighborly. So thank you for that really important message. I want to take a moment and introduce our next speaker. Dr. Patrick Smith is Associate Research Professor of Theological Ethics and Bioethics at Duke Divinity School. In addition, he serves as the director of the bioethics program for the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine, and as associate professor in population health sciences in the Department of Health Sciences at Duke University Medical School. In 2016, Dr. Smith was named a Henry Luce III Fellow in Theology. In 2019, he the Paul Ramsey Award for Excellence in Bioethics, and in 2022 he received the Edmund Pellegrino Medalist Award in Healthcare Ethics. It's a mouthful. Professor Smith previously served as a lecturer at Harvard Medical School in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. He served as core faculty for the Master of Bioethics program offered through Harvard Center for Bioethics. He was also a principal faculty member for the Initiative on Health, Religion, and Spirituality, which is an inter-faculty initiative across Harvard University that aims to be a research catalyst for an integrated model of spirituality, public health, and patient care in dialogue with spiritual communities. And currently, he is also the president-elect of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. So we are incredibly pleased to welcome Dr. Patrick Smith.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pell, for that introduction. Good morning to all of you for taking time out to be here. Thank you so much, Bob, for getting us started. Very well done. Really appreciate your framing and your analysis for the conversation here. To Dr. Husbands, your presence here, and for all of those who are members of First Baptist Church of Glendale International. And I would be remiss, being a son of a black church, that I did not acknowledge Pastor John Jenkins in his absence here as well, and bring greetings from the Union Baptist Church of Durham, where Pastor Prince Rainey Rivers is our shepherd there. So let me see here, pull up the slides. All right, good. And I'm assuming you all can, how do I get the slides to show on the back? Oh, there it is. Oh, beautiful. I just have to be patient, I suppose. All right, very good. So what I want to do is to talk a little bit about this notion of pursuing shalom through health justice towards a notion of beloved community here. Now, I want to highlight some various shades of meaning of this notion of shalom. I think it's a beautiful theological concept that does seem to capture this in-between state that Dr. Pell mentioned about the kingdom being here, yes, already in the coming of Jesus, but not yet in its fulfillment. And so how do we think about notions of penultimate flourishing that are theologically serious at the same time that are going to be aspirational, that are going to push us to not put off all of the benefits of the coming of the reign of God to the not yet, while also pursuing some of those goods in the here and now. So let me just begin with some broad framing here in terms of shalom as depiction of peace here. So the word shalom is sometimes translated as peace. While this translation is not inaccurate, the understanding of what is entailed by biblical peace is often misunderstood. So the Hebrew term shalom has much more in-depth and rich meaning. So the idea should not be equated in a reductionistic way with merely physical nonviolence, though most certainly the notion includes it. The contrast should primarily be understood between this notion of shalom and a larger form of injustice, primarily social injustice. And maybe if we have time to say more about this, sometimes social justice is considered a bugaboo word. The reality is it's an abstract concept, and the content of what is contained in social justice is going to be tradition specific and also temporal, meaning in terms of the circumstances and the dictate what content goes into expressing what that notion is. Now, the meaning is sometimes lost unless we survey many passages found in biblical text to see how it is used and the kinds of states of affairs to which it points. And so I will not be doing that work in our session today, but merely kind of summarizing some of these broad ideas here, okay? So the notion of just three shades of meaning here with this broad notion of shalom: material, relational, and moral. The first shade of meaning is in the idea of material well-being and prosperity, and this is going to refer to a physical and material state of affairs. The flourishing and well-being of God's good creation, all of creation, is the most frequent usage of God's shalom. It highlights the, and this is very important, interconnectivity, dependency, interdependency, and finitude, okay, that is part of a theology of creation. So shalom is primarily a positive idea. It is being for something, right? So this notion of scarcity was introduced, right? And I think that's really important. And one of the distinctions that's this notion of shalom as a theology of creation helps us to make is while there's finitude built into the creation, there's also a sufficiency built into the creation. Again, if we think in terms of, as we already have been brought to us, neighborliness, right, and what it means to share within the limitations that are part of God's good creation. A second shade of meaning of shalom is in its reference to good relationships between groups with one another, with the non-human animal world. So even if non-human animals or higher level primates may not be moral agents, they certainly are objects of moral reflection, and also the environment. It can refer to interpersonal relationships between individuals or within a group of individuals. And so specifically, the absence of oppression and right relatedness between people signals shalom within society. And the reason why this becomes important for the way we think about our social arrangements is because when we think about our body politics, right, not partisan politics, but our body politics, that communities and societies are more than just groups of people bumping into each other, right? We arrange our social lives in particular kinds of ways, and that kind of relatedness also matters theologically and with respect to God. Shalom making is working for just and health-giving relationships between people and nations, or helping set the conditions perhaps for the state of affairs in which health can be received in different ways and experienced broadly in the way I would want to claim and argue in different ways that God has intended for us. And so this last shade of meaning here is the presence of personal integrity and straightforwardness, which is indicative of shalom. Shalom making is working to remove deceit and hypocrisy and to promote honesty, integrity, decency, and straightforwardness in different ways here. Okay. So this notion of shalom, some would suggest, other thinkers have kind of identified, reflects the way things ought to be. Shalom defines how things should be in a material, relational, and ethical sense. However, it cannot be reduced to any one of these capacities alone. Rather, the three components must be held together to understand and pursue shalom. The three aspects of shalom are to be realized in embodied practices. So, of course, we think about the prophets, right, where this notion comes up, and the encouragement that they gave the people of God after, at times, condemning the people of God for allowing social injustice and various forms of oppression under the banner of some type of religious expression to go unchecked. And so the prophets condemned the people of God due to their inability oftentimes to realize, again, this notion or an approximation of this notion of shalom. And so we see all these things in Scripture, as already been mentioned to us. Economic flourishing and involuntary poverty coexisted. The rich and powerful often oppress the poor, and the economic benefit from these kind of social and economic arrangements gave the outward appearance of prosperity, the outward appearance that things were okay. However, it is not true shalom. Amos chapter 3. The political processes were not working honestly as unjust laws were in place. We see this in Isaiah chapter 10, right? Those first few verses there. And so shalom then in biblical tradition is a way that things ought to be. Isaiah chapter 2 here. Now, I want to say this vision of shalom is motivated and promoted by the idea of neighborly love, something we've already heard something about this morning. It is love of neighbors for their own sake. It seeks to uncover or identify the neighbor and people we meet, having deep regard and concern for them and that which contributes to their well-being. An important feature of love as a political virtue and a theological virtue is its role in the creation and preservation of community where there previously was none. That's an important emphasis that people like Paul Ramsey have raised with regard to this notion of agape love. Or as Martin Luther King and others would call it, this notion of how do we generate the terms and the conditions for a beloved community. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a staunch proponent of this kind of love, a theologian from the tradition that has nurtured me and produced me in many ways. He saw this clearly, as did so many others who came before and after him, again in this larger tradition that nurtured King. So when I teach classes on this, I like to make sure we situate him as part of a larger and broader tradition and not simply just a figure, a kind of a lone figure crying out in the wilderness, such there are a deep wealth of resources, theological, spiritual, and intellectual, that flow into the theologians from this kind of African-American social tradition, Christian tradition. He was a staunch proponent of this. He saw clearly, right, that there is, as did so many others came after him, that the relationship of social inequality and health. I think Dr. Pell mentioned this, and Dr. Husbands as well, and also Dr. Castillo. So this is a theme that is emerging, this relationship of social inequality and health. Before his speech to the Medical Committee for Human Rights during a 1966 press conference, King stated, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman because it often results in physical death. So King's understanding of love, his commitment to the idea of love community, and his work towards this goal was deeply informed by ethical resources that reflect a notion of shalom that calls us to be responsible for each other. Now, King was pointing to an idea that has been long represented and deeply embedded in Christian traditions, namely that it is important to think about health in ways, that are broader than is often captured in the modern medical model alone, and that it can help us identify what makes a health inequality in fact an injustice, and what makes health differences actual disparities. Now I want to be very clear here that the challenge here is not necessarily to ask medicine to do more than it's capable of. The issue here is saying that there is more to determine with regard to notions of health and the promotion of health than what the medical model can capture alone, We must give attention to the larger social, environmental, and political factors that have direct impacts on flourishing life and well-being. Now, St. Augustine was the Bishop of Hippo, and he wrote these words in Of the Morals of the Catholic Church. I want to just share with you a couple of different spaces from Christian tradition of these quotes that get at this idea, and so bear with me for my reading of these passages, but I think it identifies something really important. Now, in light of what I just said, there's a phrase here that Augustine uses in terms of like medicine men. Of course, he's using this masculine language, at least in this context, but I do want to qualify this language, or at least frame it in a way of thinking of certain decisions that are made in terms of what the implications of these might be for us. But Augustine says this: man then, is this coming off a section of this notion of love and love of neighbor and the importance of that, which is in keeping with the trajectory at this point. He says, man then, as viewed by his fellow man, is a rational soul with a moral and earthly body in its service. Therefore, he who loves his neighbor does good partly to the man's body and partly to his soul. What benefits the body is called medicine. What benefits the soul, discipline. Medicine here, now again, he has an expanded notion of medicine, and what I was saying earlier is this kind of modern medical model, so I take those as being distinct categories, okay? But in the context of when Augustine was writing this, he says, medicine here includes everything that either preserves or restores bodily health. It includes, therefore, not only what belongs to the art of medical men, properly so called, but also food and drink, clothing and shelter, and every means of covering and protection to guard our bodies against injuries and mishaps from without as well as from within, for hunger and thirst, and cold and heat. All the violence from without produce loss of that health, which is the point to be considered. So think about Augustine's words here in that regard. Now let me share another quote from a theologian who has been highlighted in Christian tradition in different ways, Karl Barth. And my friends who know me, who are theological ethicists, will not accuse me of being Barthian, though I think Barth is absolutely right in his exposition of thinking about what it means to talk about health and health promotion. So listen to these words out of this very robust section of the Dogmatics and regarding respect for life. And so this is an extended quote, but just try to follow these words here. He writes, the basic question of the power to be as man, and therefore of the will of this power, and therefore for real health, and the associated question of its expression and exercise are questions which are not merely to be raised and answered individually, but in concert. They are social questions. Hygiene, sport, and medicine arrive too late and cannot be more than rather feeble palliatives if such general conditions as wages, standards of living, working hours, necessary breaks, and above all housing are so ordered, or rather disordered, that instead of counteracting, they promote and perhaps even cause illness, and therefore the external impairing of the will for life and health. Respect for life in the form in which we now particularly envisage it necessarily includes responsibility for the standard of living conditions generally, and particularly so for those to whom they do not constitute a personal problem because they personally need not suffer or fear any threat from this angle. Listen to that. Sometimes we're disinterested in that because this doesn't directly impact us in the same way it may impact our neighbors, right? Or those around us. And so the question is this notion of shalom reflecting a kind of interdependency that is necessary for flourishing life? He goes on, being able to enjoy at least the possibility of health and to make measures for its protection or recovery in view of their income, food, working hours, rest, and wider interest. So he's really getting another idea that those of us who are in these spaces, who have resources, who are privileged in various ways, which we all, if we're in this room this morning, have privileges in certain ways, there are certain safeguards that we can employ to protect us from some of these kinds of misfortunes. The principle of a healthy mind and a healthy body can be so highly short-sighted and a brutal one if it is only understood individually, and not in the wider sense of a healthy mind in a healthy society. And this extension can not only mean that we must see to it that the benefits of hygiene, sport, and medicine are available for all, or at least as many as possible. It must mean that the general living conditions of all, or at least as many as possible, are to be shaped in such a way that they make not just a negative, but a positive, preventive contribution to their health, as is the case already in varying degrees with the privileged. The will for health of the individual must therefore take also the form of the will to improve, raise, and perhaps radically transform the general living conditions of all men. If there is no other way, it must assume the form of the will for a new and quite different order of society, guaranteeing better living conditions for all. Where some are necessarily ill, the others cannot with good conscience will to be well. Nor can they really do it at all if they are not concerned about their neighbors who are inevitably sick because of their social position. As I close this section here, for sooner or later, the fact of this illness will in some way threaten them in spite of the measures which they take to isolate themselves, and which may be temporarily and partially successful. When one person is ill, the whole of society is really ill in all its members. In the battle against sickness, the final human word cannot be isolation, but only fellowship. Now, those are some powerful and challenging words, and of course, theologians and ethicists and others want to maybe quibble here and there. But these are powerful words that reflect something that I think is very potent theologically. Okay, going back to a theology of creation, this notion of finitude, not to be associated necessarily with scarcity, limited goods, but yet maybe sufficient to take care of one another, and this notion that we are deeply interdependent, and as was already told to us, that we cannot do this work without community and fellowship. The church needs to be committed, of course, to these key notions once again. So how can our preaching, our teaching, our embodied practices, our witnesses, the emphases of our political theologies that we're using to operate and navigate our world, how can we continue to re-embrace the kinds of values that I would want to argue is deeply rooted in the gospel of Jesus? And so just a few of these to begin thinking and figuring out how we can craft our communal practices around this so that we can bear witness to what we say we believe about the world. The church needs to be committed to the dignity of people as persons in community, the common good, and a kind of solidarity. So the notion of dignity that I would want to highlight strongly affirms that people matter morally despite their skin color, socioeconomic status, limitations, and vulnerabilities, their religion or lack thereof that come along with being finite, socially conditioned, and embodied beings. All human beings are made in the image of God, right? And that is a precondition of that is not whether or not they attend our churches, right? All human beings are made in the image of God, and so that matters in terms of the dispositions that we have towards others, and why this notion of love becomes really important, and love connected with the notion of grace. At the end of the day, any movement towards questions of shalom and justice, if we fail to recognize that I would want to argue the primary theological foundation of that is the grace of the gospel, then I think we're going to go off track. Because when we think about the notion of grace, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, right? Such that God broke into our lives and our situations before we were deserving of it. Let's just sit with that for a minute. All right. The way I'm using the term dignity here signifies that humans are valued for who they are as they are. This is why racism is such an affront to human dignity. In fact, how people are viewed and treated precisely in the face of their human limitations, difficult circumstances, and vulnerabilities is one of the most powerful means of affirming the value or the dignity of all people here. I'm going to skip over, if we want to talk about the Wells window and the 16th Street Church having time, we would go there. But so quickly here, this notion of the common good, again, just very quickly, more could be said. A commitment to human dignity provides the impetus for a corresponding commitment to the common good. So this notion of the principle of common good widens our focus to the status of the whole society, right? Whereas we think about notions of dignity, we think about these individuals. And so a robust theological anthropology, I want to suggest, is this deep notion of persons in community. And so again, is it the case that the common goods that are important for notions of welfare and well-being and flourishing are shared in ways, not common good to each person, right, but a common good in terms of shared goods accessible to all. Then, of course, notions of human solidarity, responding ethically to questions of health promotion or trying to promote health justice or addressing disparities requires a kind of solidarity. Again, it goes back to this deep notion of interdependence that we all kind of share in the vulnerabilities that we all express in one way or another. And so we have obligations to work on behalf of one another. And of course, this notion of solidarity, which I won't go into for the sake of time now, much more could be said, but it's this realization that Martin Luther King Jr. had admonished half a century ago, that together we must learn to live as neighbors, or together we will be forced to perish as fools, right? And again, this idea of this inescapable network of mutuality. And one of the challenges in our contemporary setting, I think, is just asking ourselves, again, do we really believe it? Right? One of the challenges and struggles that we have to wrestle with is making sure a kind of cynicism or moral nihilism doesn't set in, where we actually begin to think that we can do life without scores of others in different ways. Okay. Let me just skip ahead here for the sake of time. So this notion of shalom, justice as social justice. For Christians, I want to suggest that this is deeply informed by the gospel of Jesus. In the redemptive work of what God was doing in Christ in the restoring of the broken relationships of all aspects of God's good creation, not just individual personal relationships with God, but a more comprehensive notion of reconciliation. So I want to suggest that there is a more robust concept of sin that is not just a kind of moral concept with an individual, but a kind of relational brokenness that has marked all of creation. And so if Jesus truly is a cosmic Christ, and the reconciliation, the restoration that Jesus has come to bring healing to a broken world would necessarily have implications for so many other categories of our ethical life than just as important as it is our personal relationship with God. And so this, centered in the gospel, helps to continue to expand our moral and theological vision to imagine new possibilities. And so this goes to this notion of justice being creative in some ways here. I think I have just a couple minutes to say this here. So broadly speaking, I would say social justice entails the exercise of legitimate power to ensure that benefits and penalties are distributed fairly and equitably in society, thus meaning the rights and enforcing the obligations of all parties, according to Christopher Marshall. It should be clear from this broad description of social justice that our understanding of it is necessarily going to always be contextual, particular, and historical in character. Let me say that again because it's going to become important. Contextual, particular, and historical in character. Thus, the content of social justice is not derived on the basis of isolated human speculation or autonomous human reason. Tradition-specific understandings of social justice are unavoidably conditioned by the ways of looking at life and the world which we received from the particular historical and religious traditions to which we belong, or philosophical traditions as well. Hence, a Christian understanding of social justice is to be informed and shaped by biblical and theological resources. Now, in Christian tradition, justice is this chief attribute of God. And so when we begin to think about the actions and the work of God and what we see narrated to us in Scripture as the heart of God in many ways becomes informative for many of our movements here. And so I've already mentioned there's this notion which biblical justice is creative. It has the moral vision and spiritual resources for us to reimagine our collective lives together. We don't simply just have to accept ways of being and navigating the world in relationship and community with each other. the church, this wonderful, messy and clumsy and beautiful social organization, I think is really case in point in terms of the kind of creativity that can emerge in different ways as we continue to especially try to promote notions of justice as activities on behalf of the disadvantaged as well. Second, pursuing shalom justice, I think, is a necessary instrument of love and a respect for life, right? So again, all of those sections that we read from Augustine and also from Karl Barth, the notion of love of neighbor was central to the implications of what they were saying there if we were to go back and look at the context in which they were engaging in theological reflection there. Third, biblical justice is also characterized by what some would call a principle of redress. So we see this, Luke 19, story of Zacchaeus, Leviticus chapter 5, chapter 6, right? Maybe even Leviticus 25, right? In different ways. So the notion of a principle of redress is found all throughout, I would say, the narration of many of these sacred texts. Various theological traditions have highlighted notions of redress that are really, really important for us to think about. And so if we take justice to be particular historically situated, then we have to be really careful of arguing for and wanting to implement only abstracted notions of justice. So if we start with where we are in the material conditions and we see maybe where there is a gap, and if we have some type of aspirational vision to which we want to aim, then the question is, how can we engage in principles of redress and modes of embodied justice to get from here to there, right? Such that questions of redress have to remain theologically central to any of our conversations in terms of health promotion, despite pressures to not talk about notions of redress in different ways. And I will end with this notion of the incarnation, right? That is embodied in Jesus, right? According to some, I would just want to argue in terms of my understanding of Christian tradition that the incarnation of Jesus is the epitome of divine disclosure of justice in the world. The revelation of God in the incarnation of Jesus deeply informs the moral vision of justice in an unavoidably contextual, historical, and embodied manner. All right? Christopher Marshall fleshes out this idea, I guess pun intended, right, in the following way. Listen to these words as he talks about this notion of Jesus, the embodiment of Jesus in justice. Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom of God impinged directly on the major dimensions of social and political life, the use of wealth and power, the exclusion of the weak and disadvantaged from full participation in community, and the use of lethal violence to protect the unjust status quo. Jesus was critical of the injustices of the prevailing social order and called for communal repentance. He also laid down a new ethic for his followers. In his community, the weak are to be honored. Leadership is to take the form of servanthood, and the way of nonviolent peacemaking is to prevail. Seeking to live in accordance with the vision of the coming reign of God's justice is to be the supreme concern of its existence. Now again, just like all the health programs and exercise programs we're on, some things are easier said than done. I get it. So I would not want to argue that what he's saying here is easy, but it is something to point to about the significance of the incarnation and the radical teachings of Jesus that we have to grapple with again and again. Every generation has to grapple with the teachings of Jesus and what it means to be a church that follows this radical Jesus. So it is this enfleshed embodied Jesus, the very incarnation of God the Son, who walked among us. In the words of Howard Thurman, he also was the one who stood with those whose backs are against the wall, the disinherited, the disenfranchised. It was Jesus' salvific ministry of love and justice in his teachings and actions, culminating in his work on the cross, that provides the basis for both reconciliation and liberation. Jesus is the incarnated expression of God's attribute of divine justice and love, the embodiment of God's righteousness and love. Jesus is the one who sends the Spirit along with the Father, making it possible for people to become the righteousness or the justice of God and be called to the ministry of reconciliations as ambassadors of Jesus Christ. And let me just close with three things here. And I don't have the slide up for this, but in terms of what the church and healthcare professionals and those who genuinely care about just healthcare in general can maybe think about how to operationalize and embody in different ways. First, I would suggest that we need to imagine an expanded notion of what is necessary for health beyond that of modern medicine's understanding, right? Meaning these larger social and political determinants of health that people like Barth and Augustine were getting at, and I would also say the biblical prophets. Second, think about how financial incentives and economic models of healthcare resist kind of notions of preventive type care as an overall approach to health promotion. And then third, seek to embody a commitment to solidarity in our broader political and social life. And again, political, I don't mean partisan, I mean political in the Aristotelian sense of how we think about arranging our common life together, our broader political and social life beyond the confines of professional clinical health care. And I'll just close with James Baldwin, a literary artist from a generation or two ago, and one who grew up in the church, was a childhood preacher, even though he says he left the church, but many people who continue to follow Baldwin and read him over the years say, well, he may have left the church, but it's not clear that that church left him, right? Again, when we think about his voice, and what he has to say to us in given moments, right? And so at the end of this essay called As Much Truth as One Can Bear, after this kind of painstaking analysis that he engages in, he just simply reminds us that not everything that is faced can be changed. That's absolutely true. But nothing can be changed until it's faced. And so the question that I would want to put to all of us who still lay claim to the gospel of Jesus Christ, while we may not be able to change everything that we're facing in our current moment, nevertheless, we will never be able to move towards shalom and beloved community unless we engage in the difficult work that God has empowered and equipped us to do. Thank you.